again, thank you guys for joining us. And my name's DJ. And I think for tonight, it might be best to start off with kind of initiating a little bit of vulnerability. Because, for any relationship to grow, you have to have some vulnerability there, right? So no matter what the relationship is. And I think that's, if we look at the cross, and look at the crucifix, that's what Jesus is doing, really, is initiating vulnerability because he wants to be in relationship with us. And so we're going to be talking about maybe some difficult things tonight. So I'll start by kind of initiating some vulnerability. So as Cindy mentioned, I was a classroom teacher. I was also a firefighter and a paramedic, and I learned a lot of really cool things being a firefighter and a paramedic. When I went to paramedic school, do we have any firefighters or doctors or anybody here? Medical people? Nobody? Okay. Well, I learned how to do a lot of cool things at paramedic school. I learned how to do shots, start IVs, do CPR, work the defibrillator, intubate people. And there's one thing called an intraosseous infusion. Does anyone know what this is? No? An intraosseous infusion? You know what this is, okay, or an IO for short. It's literally where you take a power drill and you drill into somebody's bone to gain access to their bone marrow so that you can administer life-saving medication to that person, because oftentimes they don't have enough blood pressure to get IV access. So I learned all of that in paramedic school, and then I got my first job at the fire department, and every little thing was slightly different. All the tools and everything were slightly different, so I had to relearn everything. And it was a bunch of training, and I remember relearning everything, where it is on the truck, because you could be out at 3 a.m. and you have to know where it is on the truck in the dark, how to use it. And the time came for me to relearn the bone drill. It was a different bone drill I've never seen before, didn't know how to work it, but I thought to myself, when am I ever going to use this bone drill, right? What are the chances? So I put that training off. In our firehouse, it had big screen TVs, it was warm, this was in the winter time. And so I put that training off, and that was a pretty big mistake, because I can vividly remember we got a 911 phone call. It came in as just a routine traffic accident, a fender bender. And so I petitioned my captain. I was the young firefighter. I was like, can I go out on this one, Captain? I got this one. And he's like, well, kid, you're not even going to make it to the scene of the accident. They're going to radio that they don't need you because it's a fender bender, but go for it, kid. I was like, yes. So I got in the ambulance with the partner, and we went there, and all of a sudden, over the radio, it changed a little bit. So we moved locations, and we ended up on the highway, and we made it. We were the first people on scene, and we didn't get called off. And it turned out that this was not just a fender bender. This was a multi car pileup, hundreds of cars pileup. We were the first people on scene. I remember getting on the radio and looking. I said, just send backup. We need like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 cars I see that need the jaws of life to cut them out. Send heavy rescue. Send to everybody. And so I got out. There was a guy that had a pretty big cut on his head, and he came over to me, and I was like, sit right here, sir. We're getting everything under control. And then over in the embankment, these people were waving, the most frantic waving that I'd ever seen in my entire life. And they ran up, and they handed me a little kid that had been hit by a car. And this kid was in really bad shape. And so I remember my partner and I get everything going, start working on this kid, get the CPR, get everything going, the IV. And the mother of the child, I can remember, was standing about a couple feet away from us, watching us working on their kid as we wait for backup. My partner looks at me and he goes, DJ, get the drill, do an IO, now. And I remember opening up the bag, looking at the drill, and my heart just sinking as I realized immediately, I have no idea how to use this. Okay, not trying to be dramatic, but initiating some vulnerability. Probably one of the worst moments of my life was catching eye contact with that mom for that split second and just thinking to myself, your child's gonna die because I put that training off. And it was a horrible, horrible feeling. And, by the grace of God, backup arrived. We were able to pass the child off to another crew to get them to the hospital in time. But horrible, horrible feeling. Now, the reason I mention this is because, we're here tonight. And when it comes to training, sometimes we don't feel like doing the training. There's a lot of people, you mention the term like, talk to your children about God's plan for their sexuality. It's scary. But this training is really vital for us because we're going to have to use it. And so if we can avoid being in that moment when we're there and our kids are ready for us to speak to them, give them the truth and they're open, to not be thrown back into that ambulance situation of thinking, oh, I put that training off. So that's why I'm very excited that you're here today. So kudos to you. Like really, I'm not just blowing smoke. Like thank you for being here because this is really important. And the fact that you're here shows that you guys are great parents. You ready to dive into this? Okay, cool. All right, don't be nervous. It's not gonna be that crazy, okay? But I wanted to give some tips here when it comes to talking specifically about purity with our children, okay? So this is a talk that I've given, just 7 practical purity points for parents, just some suggestions here. So a couple of points here. First off, don't be afraid, okay? Do not be afraid. One of the first words of John Paul II's pontificate, right? Do not be afraid. So sometimes parents think that they have to shove this off and it's somebody else's job to talk to their kids about this. And, I'm going to send them to that camp or they're going to receive this talk. But the church says that we are the primary educators of our children. And so there was this group called the National Campaign to Prevent Teen Pregnancy. And they do a study every year of over 1,000 high school age, teenage kids, and they ask them the question, who is the number one influence when it comes to your decisions about sex? And you can imagine what they say, right? Probably like their friends or the TV or the internet. Overwhelmingly, every single year, do you know what the number one answer is? It's you. It's you, the parents. Wow, congratulations. Did you know this? You are the number one influence about your children's decisions regarding sexuality. Okay? So, sometimes we think like, oh, if I could really get like a really cool kid to like give a talk or something and be like, chastity's cool, then they would really listen. No, it's you. It's time to actually take this power that God has given you and get started. Okay? So do not be afraid. Your children are looking up to you, and they really want you to reach out to them and guide them on this journey. Now, so there's the graph here. As you can see here, parents' number one response. And that's true also for their age levels and also for the demographics that they grow up in. Pretty cool. All right, point number 2, prayer. Prayer. I always say, with prayer, I love this quote from Pope Benedict. He said that man is a relational being. And if his first fundamental relationship is disturbed, his relationship with God, then nothing else can truly be in order. And so I always say, have the talk with God before you have the talk with your child. We can't give what we don't have. And so, we have a lot of scars and we have a lot of, stuff that we didn't receive as teenagers growing up. And so it's upon us to really go to God and open up those scars, open up those wounds to God and ask to be filled so that we can give to our kids from an abundant overflow instead of from an empty vessel. And so, when it comes to our personal purity as well, I think a lot of people don't even ask for purity. They don't even ask for the gift of purity. Kind of pray that prayer of St. Augustine of make me pure, but not yet. And so asking for this gift, because purity is not less, purity is actually more. It allows us to not devalue the other, but to see the other as they truly are and rejoice in the person and the glory of the human person before God. So prayer, we could go on and on and on about prayer. Of course, all the things I always carry with me, a rosary at all times. This is my rosary here. I got 4 little ones at home. They keep breaking my rosary, so I had to make this one out of 550-pound paracord so they wouldn't break it. So if you need to make a sturdy one, paracord's the way to go. Okay, now let's get informed about what kind of like the State of the Union address here. What is really at stake when it comes to our child's decisions about sex? So we know that it's no longer an option for us to put this off. The culture is out there in full force, and it will talk to our kids no matter what. And so it's upon us to really take the initiative here and be formed ourselves. So no matter where you go, there's going to be a whole bunch of stuff out there. This was just a screenshot I took from my computer a couple months ago when I was ordering Chipotle. And so we had like this on here, which was like which trans burrito do you want? And so that was there. We know that this is Blue's Clues. So if you're familiar with that show, geared at like kindergarten age kids and preschool age kids, they had pride parades and those sort of things going on in there. And so they're coming after our kids. The porn agenda. So the porn industry really does have an agenda. It's to expose your child to porn, normalize the use of porn, and then profit. And so some of the sneaky things that the porn industry's done. Pornhub is the largest pornography website in the world. They launched a campaign out there. You can see that's a billboard on New York City's Times Square, and they replaced their slogan was "All you need is hand," which is a spin-off of the old Beatles song "All You Need Is Love." So they actually went as far as hiring a chorus to sing "All You Need Is Love," but changed the lyrics, and so that was part of their marketing. They actually launched a scholarship, $25,000 scholarship, to tell people write in and how the pornography website has changed their lives. They launched something called the Pornhub Cares initiative, which was geared towards authentic sexual education, trying to bring it into the schools, so using pornography essentially as sexual education. And so, I'm not trying to freak everybody out. Do not be afraid, right? But the time is now for us. We can no longer just be reactive. We really have to form ourselves so that we can guide our students and our children through this journey. Now, as far as pornography exposure, the average age now is the first pornography exposure is between 8 and 11 years old. Based on what statistics you look at, it's almost 100% of boys will be exposed to hardcore internet pornography before they turn 18. It's a little bit lower for girls. And when it comes to pornography, what can pornography really do when someone sees it? So we're going to talk about like the moral effects, of course, but what happens, when somebody sees pornography? Because I look at pornography, I think of it as a drug when somebody sees this. Okay, so let's do a little experiment here. I want you to look at the screen for 20 seconds. Nothing scary will pop out, I promise. Okay, now look at this image. Are the clouds moving? Okay, they're not actually moving. They might appear like they're moving, but this is something called the visual after effect. Okay, so something that we looked at actually went in, changed our brain a little bit there. And so there's a doctor named Dr. William M. Struthers, and he described what happens when somebody sees a pornographic image, what happens when it goes into the brain. He said that it comes in through the retina, goes through the thalamus, then projects up to the visual cortex, goes to the associative cortex, and the anterior cingulate, which then projects down to the insular cortex, the mirror neuron system, the basal ganglia, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus. This is the sexual arousal center, the interstitial nucleus of the anterior hypothalamus, sends projections down to the ventral tegmental area, which then releases dopamine. And so visual stimulus going in and actually releasing chemicals within the brain. And so it's interesting to see a lot of these groups that are now emerging that are against pornography, and they're not Christian, they're not Catholic, they're secular organizations. There was an organization called NoFap, which is a organization of hundreds of thousands of people on a website called Reddit that were against pornography. There's another one out there called Fight the New Drug, which goes around and gives presentations to high schoolers. And so some of the studies that are out there, it's pretty interesting of what actually this can happen. So there's a linkage to shrinkage in the brain, the gray area in the brain, which is the decision area in the prefrontal cortex. When somebody sees pornography, there's a chemical that's released called norepinephrine, which chemically burns the images into their brain. So it could take seconds to look at, but it could take years and years to forget. And there's a bunch of these young adult men started an organization, this NoFap organization, because they were realizing something called porn-induced erectile dysfunction. And so they were actually unable to engage in sex because of their porn use. And so, interesting to see that all these scientific studies that are coming out. So what is really at stake? There's a lot at stake, okay? Now, when it comes to chastity. There's a lot at stake as well. We can go through all these statistics, but I'd like to go in and answer these questions at a deeper level, right? Let's tell our children the truth about God's plan for sexuality. Now, when it comes to sex education, I work for the Rural Woods Institute. We've developed the world's first K through 12 supplemental theology of the body curriculum. It does not teach about the birds and the bees, but people think it's sex education, and we say it's not sex education. Well, we say it's partially correct to say that it is sex education because the word sex always first refers to identity before it refers to activity, right? So the theology of the body really addresses who are you, right? It's Humanity 101, understanding who we are as human persons. Now, once we understand the truth, it can really flip everything up and put it in right order. I love the quote from John Paul II saying that the problem with pornography is not that it shows too much, but it shows too little. So let's talk and ask the question first, who is God? Okay, I like to say that God is the gift exchange. So God is the gift exchange. And so in the Catechism it says in paragraph 221 that God has revealed his innermost secret. God himself is an eternal exchange of love, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And he's destined us to share in that exchange. So let's break this down a little bit here. So we have God, an eternal exchange of love, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Okay, God is love, as it says in 1 John, right? So if we think of it in this terms, we have God the Father pours himself out, makes a total gift of self to the Son. The Son in turn receives the gift of the Father, doesn't grasp at the will of the Father, receives it, and in turn pours himself out, making a total gift of self to the Father, giving and receiving. The giving and receiving is so profound, so amazing that it is, right? Holy Spirit. And so within the Trinity, as pointed out by the Catechism, we see a giving, a receiving, and a pouring forth of new life. Giving, a receiving, and a pouring forth of new life. Giving, receiving, pouring forth of new life. Now, John Paul II mentions the sacramentality of the body. And so a sacrament, in very loose terms, is a visible sign of an invisible reality. And so thinking of the body in terms of the sacramentality of a visible sign of an invisible reality, pretty interesting, right? One of the thesis statements of the theology of the body says that the body, in fact, and only the body, is capable of making visible what is invisible, the spiritual and the divine. And so let's talk about this. The way that I explain this to the kids is through the movie The Lion King. You guys seen this movie? Probably. It's a little older, right? So Simba, if you're not familiar, his father passes away, and then he leaves the pride, and he goes and hangs out with with the warthog and the prairie dog thing, or what is it? Pumbaa and the Timon. Okay, yeah, so you got it. Okay, and then he grows up, and then he returns to the pride, right? And then he sees the wise baboon Rafiki, and he knows who he is, right? And he's like doing the weird thing, like and he's like, who are you? And he's like, that is not the question. The question is, who are you? Right? Asking Simba all weird, and he's like, I thought I knew. I don't know anymore. And he goes, I know who you are. You are Mufasa's boy, right? And then he chases him, and he's like, what? You knew my father? And he goes, correction, I know your father, right? And he's like, well, my father passed away. And he's like, nope, you're wrong again, right? Come with Rafiki, I'll show you the way. And where does he take him? He takes him to the little watering hole, right? And he says, look there in the water, right? And so he looks, and what does he see? He sees his reflection. And his heart kind of sinks, and he's like, you stupid baboon, this is just my reflection. And then he says the pivotal moment, the pivotal words there. No, look harder, right? He says, look harder. And so he looks harder, And that's the crazy moment of the movie, right? When the clouds burst open and his father Mufasa there, he says, Simba, you are son of the one true king. You have forgotten me and thus have forgotten who you are. Remember who you are, right? That's the sacramentality of the body, people. So the question is, when you go home tonight, you get changed or whatever, and you're in front of the mirror, you look at your body, do you see an image of God within your body? I know I don't, right? Perhaps we need to listen to Rafiki and look harder, right? So let's look a little harder. Let's look a little harder. So we have here, okay, now we are going to approach this very delicately, okay? A lot of wounds here, a lot of scars here, a lot of traps here. Let's approach with caution. The marital embrace. Do you understand what I mean when I say the marital embrace? Bow chicka wow wow. Okay, you guys got it? Okay, sexual intercourse. Okay, got it. Okay, so the marital embrace. Within the marital embrace, the husband and wife, they give to one another. What do they give to one another in the marital embrace? Themselves, okay. Let's get biological here. Their bodies, okay. What is it? Sperm and egg, okay? The sex cells, okay? What is contained within the sperm and the egg? DNA, what is DNA? It is the blueprint of their identity. You were right. They give themselves, right? A gift of themselves, right? And so we see here, the husband makes a total gift of self to the wife. The wife, in active receptivity, receives the gift of the husband and in turn pours herself, gives a total gift of self to the husband. And sometimes this giving is so amazing, so profound that it is, right? It is a third, right? And that baby will just stab the dad right in the eyes. Doesn't look what he's doing? Like, so within the marital embrace, we see a giving, a receiving, and a pouring forth of new life. A giving, a receiving, a pouring forth of new life. Giving, receiving, pouring forth of new life. An image of the Trinity. And something that I thought growing up was evil. I thought it was evil. That's where the confusion came in. It was like, okay, sex is bad. Everything with sex is bad. It's bad. But then you get married, and then I guess it's permissible to have children, and then the Catholic Church is confused, right? That was my experience growing up. Nobody told me the truth, because you see, what if there was an angel, a very high angel, that saw God's plan and said, "Oh, okay, great. You're going to make humans. Oh, you're going to give humans the power. You're going to let the blessing of fruitfulness fall upon the angels. Remember, can't have babies, right? And so when you saw that and you were disgusted and then you rebelled against God and said, no way. And then you hated the humans. You hated anything that pointed to God. You hated everything that pointed to God. What's the first thing that you would attack? The most obvious sign. Remember, the devil cannot create. The devil can only distort. The devil has no clay. Right? And so he's after this ferociously. He wants to distort the marital embrace any way that he can. And let's be real. A lot of us we got some scars when it comes to understanding this. Like I remember reading in the catechism, it says that it's talking about the marital embrace. So it's essentially the chaste acts of the husband and wife within a sacramental marriage, i.e. the marital embrace. You know what it says about that? The catechism, the teaching book of our faith. It says the marital embrace is bad, dirty. No. It says noble and honorable. I read that the first time and I was like, what? That's not the church I grew up in. And so there was a long process of me having to ask God to remove the scars from my eyes, remove all the junk from my heart, the twisted desires, unravel it so that I could truly see God's plan for what he has done for us. So that's one of the biggest things that I think, unfortunately, our children are receiving kind of mixed messages when it comes to the marital embrace. We got to take back ownership of this because the devil's claiming it, and he wants to distort it. So, when it comes to that, we know, of course, Sister Lucia, one of the little Fatima kids, remember, she said that the final battle between the Lord and the reign of Satan will be about marriage in the family. She says, do not be afraid, because anyone who works for the sanctity of marriage in the family will always be fought and opposed in every way, because this is the decisive issue. However, Our Lady has already crushed its head. And so it can be daunting to think about this, to talk about this, to ask God to unravel everything so that we could truly see. But because the devil's in full force, it reminds me of the statues that you see of Our Lady. She's stepping on the head of the serpent, and the serpent's tail is just whipping around everywhere. She's knocking stuff off the table, right? Don't look at the serpent. Look at the piece of Mary's eyes as she slowly just crushes the head of the serpent. Take this back. Don't let the devil try to claim ownership. He's a liar. He wants to distort it. Now, John Paul II says that we have to conclude that all the sacraments of the New Covenant find their prototype in some way in marriage as the primordial sacrament. And so, to think of it like this, before original sin, how many sacraments were there? Marriage, right? And so it's kind of like you look through a prism, white light passing through a prism, then you get Roy G. Biv, right? If you think about the primordial sacrament in a way, right? Marriage before original sin, and then original sin, of course, the void happening, marriage as the primordial sacrament. And we can see if we look closely, little bits and elements of the primordial sacrament in the 7 sacraments of the New Covenant. And so, no wonder that marriage is under such attack. It's under such attack. And so it's on us to really, not to say that the Catholic Church is obsessed with marriage and sex. It's not. It's pointing in, actually, the culture is obsessed with it. We give it the proper reverence and understanding. Because in philosophy and everything, we see reality as it truly is. Now, one more thing that we could potentially touch on here, right? I always like this. We're all a bunch of 2x4s. We're created to love, by love, for love. A bunch of the teachers had 2x4s in their classrooms, and they were showing the kids. They're like, as the kids were switching, they're like, Johnny, remember who you are, man. Created to love, by love, for love. 2x4, right? And they're like, Mr. Johnson's a psycho, right? But this begs the question, how are we to even look at another person? How are we to look at another person? Because if the marital embrace is good, if sexual desire is actually something created by God, how do we even look at another person? So it reminds me of a comedy sketch that was out there a couple of years ago of these 2 guys that were dressed up like they lived in the backwoods. And it was a comedy sketch, and one guy was going to date the other guy's sister, and the guy stopped him and said, look at here, buddy. If anybody's going to be dating my sister, it's going to be me. So that is actually the Catholic Church's teaching on how to look at another person. Sounds a little weird? Okay. It's in the Bible. John Paul II points this out. Okay. In the book of Tobit, in the Song of Songs, we see 2 lovers pouring their love out to one another in this beautiful poetry. And look at the way that the addresses his beloved. He says, you have ravished my heart, my sister, my bride. How beautiful is your love, my sister, my bride. A garden enclosed, my sister, my bride. A garden enclosed, a fountain sealed. First calls her sister before he calls her bride, recognizing her dignity and humanity before he calls her his bride. And so it's actually been rumored that some of the saints, I believe it was the Martins, Zeli, and I forget what the rest of it, rumored, I think, that they actually used as their pet names for one another, instead of like babe or sweetie or honey, they used brother and sister. So we got some couples here tonight. If you'd like to try that out, you could go for it. All right, that'd be a little. I tried it once with my wife. Whoa. It was one time. Okay, so we have 4 little kids. I remember one time you wake up in the morning, usually they're like awake and they like stare at you and then like cough in your face and stuff. But we woke up, no kids were in the bed. I was awake, my wife was asleep, she had like 1,000 covers on, right? The sunlight was shining through the blinds, and I was watching her while she slept. This sounds a little creepy, right? But it started to get like slow-mo cinematic, and I just looked at her, and the prayer that came out of me was, God, thank you for my sister, my bride. Help me to love her the way that you love her. Help me to see her the way that you see her. My sister, my bride. And whoa, it was like going into my heart, like crunching all the distorted desires, killing concupiscence, and letting love reign. Reordering the desires of the heart. Man. So, I encourage you, do that. Now, when it comes to our desires, somebody pointed this movie out to me. It's called Frozen. Maybe you've seen this before if you've got little kids. I always like the movie references. But if you've never seen this movie, somebody told me that's a metaphor for sexual desire and the haunted body and eros and all this stuff. And I was like, okay, really? So it's two sisters. When they're young, the one sister realizes she has a special power. A special power. She can shoot snow out of her hands, right? And in the beginning of the movie, she had perfect mastery over this power. She was making little snowmen and stuff. It was cool. Then the fall happened. She zapped her sister in the head with snow. She fell, the fall. And then their parents saw that, they freaked out, and they put her on a horse, and they took her out into the sisters out into the woods to these old rocks that were actually trolls. They said that's a symbol of the Catholic Church, the ancient church. And so they healed the girl. They said ice in the head is easier to heal than ice in the heart. But then they looked at the girl and their special power, ability to shoot the snow, and they looked at her and said, the power is very strong with her. You need to repress it. And so she put those gloves on, if you remember in the movie, and then she like locked herself in the room and sang the sad song, like, conceal, don't feel, don't let it show, right? And she was like sad and it was miserable. So she repressed that gift for so long that she couldn't repress it any longer. And so what did she do? You know the song. She ended up, let it go, right? She sang the let it go, and she thought she was free. That's even one of the lyrics in the song. I'm free, let it go, right? I've seen it a couple times. But it was a false freedom because she caused an eternal winter, and that big ice castle she built for herself, it actually turned in on her. False freedom. And so repressing the gift led to misery. Letting it go, doing whatever she wanted, led to misery. What was the only thing that ended that eternal winter at the end of the movie? Do you remember? It was Christ-like sacrificial love. Yes. They know how to tell a story. A lot of the Disney stuff's just rip-offs. So like Lion King is a rip-off of what? The one Shakespeare. Yeah. But that Christ-like sacrificial love that you saw there. And she looked at herself and this power through the lens of love. So somebody told me, that's like sexual desire. You know, we have this weird thing going on that we think that we're taught to repress this desire by the church, which is not what it teaches. But the culture says, let it go, do whatever you want. They both lead to misery. Both lead to misery. And so when it comes to sexual desire, it can be distorted. But remember, the devil has no clay. He cannot create it, only distort. And so if we ask the question, why, oh why, God, would you give us human persons an intense desire for communion? Well, it makes sense, right? Because we're creatures created for communion. So we desire union with another human because we're created in the image and likeness of communion. And so getting to the core of why we have desire, making sense of it, telling our kids this. Because man, I don't know about you, but I grew up in a lot of confusion. And it just, man, you know, I have a 9-year-old, a 7-year-old, a 5-year-old, and a 2-year-old. And, you know, as we slowly get these conversations started, respecting their innocence, the church says that there's a period of innocence that we shouldn't rush into tell them the birds and the bees. It's usually that time between kindergarten or like preschool age and then as they start into puberty, right? So we shouldn't be overly eager to tell them immediately and spoil that innocence because they're entitled to that. So we have to kind of watch our children and see when they're ready and asking the questions. And so when it comes to the talk, it's not just one talk. Thousands and thousands and thousands of talks. So when it comes to, here's some practical stuff here before we'll go some discussion here. So setting some clear boundaries. So this is when pornography shows up, and unfortunately our kids, we have to be prepared for pornography to show up on some device, on some friend's device, on somewhere, on some billboard, on some place. So there's a book, I have a table over there, I'll put these over there, but with some resources. But there's a book called Good Pictures, Bad Pictures. Anybody heard of this book before? Yeah, so Kristen Jensen wrote this. This is not a Catholic book, it's a secular book, but they look at the brain chemistry, and this is something that you could read to your children, and it really, it's really straightforward in giving practical tips on what to do when pornography shows up. And so I recommend, thinking about pornography, like TNT, like dynamites. Okay, we got to do something here. So think of TNT. So this is the TNT method. First, turn away. So I tell my kids, if it shows up, bad picture, turn away. Close the device, turn it off immediately, look away. Why? Because seconds matter when it comes to pornography exposure. I was exposed to pornography in the first grade by my older brother, and I can still remember that image today. Norepinephrine is released in the brain, chemically burning those into the brain, so it could take seconds to look at, but it could take years and years and years to forget. Thinking about their future spouse now, because there's so many people, myself included, that have been exposed to this junk, and what actually happens, it ruins intimacy in marriage. It literally tries to force your spouse to be reduced to literally a movie screen up in all these images that have been burned into the brain or just projected upon, and we objectify that person. And so thinking about their future spouse right now, step 1 of the TNT method, turn away, okay? Step 2, name it. I won't go into all the science of everything of naming it, but they recommend verbally calling it out. Kristen Jensen, they recommend labeling it like, that's pornography, or that's not okay. Well, we're Catholic, so we can take it a step further here. This is an opportunity to pray, because this is not just a matter problem, this is a spiritual problem that we're fighting as well, okay? Body, soul, unity, that's what we are as human persons. And so, give them something simple like Psalm 51. Not the whole thing. You can say, create in me a clean heart. Or Matthew chapter 5, verse 8. Blessed are the pure of heart, for they shall see God. Give them a holy object to touch. That's one of the reasons why I carry a rosary with me at all times. I always like just having a holy object here as a reminder. I heard one priest that said that he actually put a card with the creed in it, and he would touch the creed to remind himself in his breast pocket. So, having that, turn away, name it. And then step 3, one of the most important parts, assuring the child that they are not in trouble, that this is something that there's an industry, there's a whole culture after them. You are not in trouble. If this shows up, turn it off immediately, turn away, name it, and then you have to tell me, and I will love you. Because if you think about this, the devil wants to accuse us. He's the accuser. If Jesus was in the room with me after I was exposed to pornography in the first grade, oh man, I had this scenario so many times. I was like, he's going to hate me. He's going to hate me. You know what Jesus would do? His eyes would well up with tears, and he would grab me as a full first grader, and he would just be bawling. I would have the hot tears on my back, and he would just say, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, my son. This is not the way it's supposed to be. This is not the way it's supposed to be. And it breaks my heart because I feel like I'm going to have to do this with my kids. They're going to get exposed to this stuff in one way or another sometime. And it's not the way it's supposed to be. Tell them the truth, right? The TNT method. Now, little things about desire in general, and sometimes we can get very scrupulous with this of, have I sinned if I had an impure thought? It was actually your former pastor who's on our radio in Cincinnati at 11 o'clock every day. They replay his old stuff that maybe you've heard him, Father John Ricardo. Maybe in this somewhere. You never heard of this guy? Oh, yeah. But he had a great analogy, and he used traffic as an analogy. He's like, if an impure image or something or a thought pops up into your head, it's kind of like traffic. Don't worry if it pops up, you haven't sinned. It's like if you're standing next to the highway and a car's whizzing by, just let it go. Let it go. Don't freak out, just let it go. You have to engage the will in order for it to be sinful. So if it drives by, but all of a sudden you jump out into traffic and you're like, stop! And you're like, oh, nice tires. Look at the windshield, right? That's where it can be sinful. But I know myself, on this journey myself, I tended towards scrupulosity of like really beating myself up about stuff and putting stuff into perspective of, okay, you're going to have attacks, just let it go. Let it go on by. That's an opportunity to pray. And the devil, when he tempts us, he hates it when we pray. So use that little Bible verse, right? Because I thought these impure thoughts popping into my head, I thought they were big boulders dragging me down to hell. But if you pray, the devil hates it because those temptations that he puts in front of us, they're not big boulders dragging us down to hell. They become light little balloons that are raising us to heaven. And the devil gets tired of tempting us, and he hates it, so pray. So what an amazing gift that you could give your kids when this shows up. Opportunities for temptation actually become opportunities for prayer, to grow in holiness. So, now I'll leave you with one story, and then we'll take a break and do some discussion. But I remember my wife, so we got married, and we had like a really great ceremony. We really liked music, so we got like our best good friends that are really great singers to sing for our mass. And then the reception happened. And there's all those things they're supposed to do at the reception, right? Like I don't know where this stuff came from. You're supposed to shove the cake in each other's face or whatever, and then the first dances, then you throw the flowers, and then there's that thing that's like somewhat a little like weird where you're like supposed to like get that like, what's that, like underwear thing or what's that? Garter. You're supposed to get that thing and then like throw it to like all the guys, like, yeah, right? So if you did that, that's cool. Well, I didn't do that, the garter thing, not because I was holier than thou or whatever, but because her dad's a cop, right? And her brother's a cop. So I was like, I'm not even going there. So we had a live band, and there was a piano up there, and so I wrote my wife a love song. Don't get excited, because it was not good, okay? Okay. So I wrote this love song, and so I said, I'll play this for you, and then you can hand me the garter thing, and then I'll throw it to all the sweaty guys, right? And so I played the song, and part of the lyrics were, I will not give up. When you call my name, I'll come running. So I played it for her. We both cried. I threw the garter. 7 years later, I started getting more into music, and I like playing music. I'll play for our church, too. And that's a big part of my prayer life is, in our basement, playing the piano, praise and worship songs to God, right? I got some old Gather books, right? There's some jams in there in the Gather book, right? And so I'll be playing those. But 7 years later, it occurred to me. In a moment of prayer, I was playing these praise and worship songs to God, and all of a sudden, subconsciously, in the moment, that love song that I had written to my wife had just subconsciously popped into my brain, going out of my arms. In the moment of prayer, that love song from my wife had transformed into a love song to God. That was a moment that I got it. Oh, that's why you created us human persons, male and female. Not just one way to be human, male and female. And upon that sexual difference, the blessing of fruitfulness fell upon that union. And the first command you gave us was to be fruitful and multiply. Oh, that's why we're drawn to one another. That's why we have these desires to lead to you. And that's why the devil's after us so much, to distort it, because he hates you. But if we open our desires, open our hearts to God, we can see that this stuff that the devil has really rampaged against and twisted up, we unravel it. And it's a big process. We can start to see God's original plan for life and love revealed in our bodies. And if we can understand this, even a little bit as parents, and give this gift to our children, oh my gosh, the heartache that I could have avoided. The heartache that I could have avoided. That's one of the biggest things that people get mad at when they start learning about this theology of the body and they're reading it. They say, how come nobody ever told me this? You're kidding me. And so, dipped our toes in it a little bit today. A little bit today.